welcome to another episode of LED Live, everyone. We're grateful that you could join us on another Friday at noon, which is typically when we air, but not always. Today, we're going to talk about the history of the Sabbath, which has been, something we have touched on here and there on our show. And we want to talk about how this has been for a very long time and what that relevance has for us today. Like, how did these things come about? How did people observe it? When? What people groups? And so to help guide us through that, we have James, who's very familiar with this topic and has presented on it many times before. James, you also have a YouTube channel, right, where you're discussing lots of things from history. So if you're a student of history and you like to learn about interesting things from history, where do they go?
Yeah, so it's going to be Biblical Hope, which is just one word. There's no space between them, but yeah, Biblical Hope.
Biblical Hope on YouTube. Check it out. And so where are we going to start today? What time period are we going to start? Obviously, we know that the Sabbath was something instituted in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're launching from there, or are we going to launch later on in history, more modern times?
Yeah, so I think most people are probably familiar with the Sabbath as it was before the time of Christ. Maybe most people are familiar that, it began at creation. We see that in Genesis 2, where the Lord blesses the Sabbath day. And even in the context of the commandment itself in Exodus 20, we see where the commandment itself references God blessing the Sabbath at creation. But the part where it gets really contested is around the time of Christ. You see a lot of people talking about, it shifted to Sunday because that's when Christ resurrected. And their perception is that the early church did so in unity and that there was this entire transformation to Sunday, and that Sabbath keeping didn't really come back on the pages of history until maybe 1900 years later. And that's just really not reflected in the documents that we have. And so we're going to take a look at those today, and maybe some scripture texts as well, to see some allusions to what happened. And let's dive right in. So I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with some of these scripture texts. Matthew 24 verse 20, Christ said in that chapter about, "Pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day." And do you guys know what he was referencing at that time? What is Matthew 24 all about?
The end of time.
Right.
Or at least that's what the disciples were inquiring about when Jesus launched into this whole speech. They think the world is falling apart and ending when he's talking about these things.
So my question is, why would Christ reference the Sabbath day in an event that was yet future and beyond the cross if the Sabbath day was no longer to be observed or no longer an institution? So it had to have continued past the time of the cross.
Yeah, the historical reality of this is he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, which is coming, which happens in 70 AD. So why is Jesus asking them, pray that your flight's not on the Sabbath in 70 AD? It hasn't occurred yet. He's assuming they're still going to be doing that,
right? Which
is a fascinating point.
Right. And, we see that was the custom of Christ. In Luke 4:16, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Now, if we're Christians and we want to follow the example of Christ, well, here's an example that Christ set that we want to follow. And, Paul did so himself. In Acts 17 verse 2, Paul went to the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbaths, he reasoned them from the scriptures. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, Paul went in there just because he wanted to proselytize to the Jews, right? But let's take a look at Acts 13, verse 42. Did Paul go there to preach exclusively to the Jews?
No.
No, we see the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. And so it was a day for both Jews and Gentiles. In fact, if you go back to ancient Israel, which came out of Egypt, the law applied to the mixed multitude. Was the mixed multitude just Jews, or was it Jews and Gentiles?
It's Jews and Gentiles.
Exactly. So it was something that was made for mankind, and that's what Christ said in Mark.
The other thing I find fascinating is it's a perfect opportunity to breach something different. Jesus is like, let me clarify, that's going to be on Sunday. Or Paul, like, you know what? You guys don't have to come here to the synagogue on Sabbath. I'll just meet with you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Doesn't say that, doesn't suggest that, doesn't insinuate that.
Yeah. And, one of the classic texts that's used that people try and prove it with is Acts 20, verse 7, where they gather together and break bread. But the problem is Acts 2, verse 46 shows that they broke bread daily. So if you're doing this every day, what does that prove about Sunday? If it's something you're doing every day of the week, including the seventh day, I might add.
No more sacred than any other day.
Exactly.
Right.
In Acts 16:13, we read, on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. So this isn't just the synagogue that he's going to. He's going to where prayer is customarily made. He's wherever, he's going and meeting on the Sabbath day to speak to these people. Now, we said a moment ago about Jews and Gentiles. Well, let's take a look at Acts 18, verse 1. Is Paul arguing exclusively to Jews on the Sabbath day in Acts 18, verse 1? Well, we read down in verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both
Jews and Greeks.
Exactly. So this isn't just, a proselytization to Jews. He is speaking to mankind on the Sabbath day. And, Paul himself, the same person who wrote, Colossians 2:16 and 17, which people are going to try and argue for, the Sabbath no longer being kept, which actually references the ceremonial Sabbaths, spoke about this Sabbath, the moral Sabbath. He said, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for the one who's entered his rest has himself rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest so that no one will fall, though following the same example of disobedience. Now, guys, let me ask you a question. Is resting on Sunday resting as God rested?
No.
No, because he's referencing back to Genesis. That's what he's talking about. And he's saying God rested from his work. So it's talking about the seventh day after creation. That's how God rested. And so this is an interesting passage. I wrote a paper on this. And this is the only time where the word sabbatismos appears in Greek. It's the only time. And I traced this passage in Hebrews 3 and 4 all the way back to Exodus through the Bible, and it's very clear that it's talking about the seventh day Sabbath, and so and Paul puts it in a way that shows that it's about righteousness by faith.
Yeah,
that is it's a beautiful picture.
Some Bible translations translate that Sabbath rest as just rest, and I got to wonder if those translators were translating sabbatismos as just rest to avoid the condemnation of the verse for their own actions.
When you look at the commentaries of all these people who are biblical scholars, they really try to push the envelope. They'll come like right up to trying to deny it, but they know that they can't, because if you're going to be true to the text and, and see what it's saying and realize this is a reference to Genesis, and then there's other clues, that it would not be intellectually honest, it would not be intellectually honest to dismiss it.
James, you brought up Colossians, and so for our audience, can you make a distinction between the ceremonial Sabbath and the moral Sabbath?
Yeah, so Colossians 2:16, starting at verse 14, it talks about the law that stood as a witness against us. And if you go back to Deuteronomy 31, verse 26, you can see the law that stood against us was this one that sat on the side of the ark. And so it was not the one within, but it was the one that sat beside the ark. Paul declares that the law is holy, just, and good. And what we find here is a distinction about the ordinances. And if you go back to Ephesians 2:15, we see that the law contained in ordinances was abolished. And that word abolished is the same one where Christ speaks regarding the moral law back in Matthew, where think not that I have come to abolish the law, but to fulfill. So the moral law remains, but the law contained in ordinances in Ephesians 2:15 was abolished. And so when we take a look at the context of those ordinances in Colossians 2:16 and 17, it's talking about meat and drink, and it's talking about Sabbath days. Now, the Decalogue doesn't mention anything about food or drink,
Right.
but if you go back to Leviticus 23, you can see that there is a reference to meat and drink, and festival Sabbaths in the context of the ceremonial law, which was all instituted to point forward to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And so when he came and fulfilled all of that, there's no need for that. But the moral law remains and is established as Paul taught in Hebrews 4. So,
Excellent. Thank you.
yeah. Now, we're not alone in this position on the early church. Theodore Zayn was a German Protestant theologian and nominated for a Nobel Prize in literature 3 times. But his commentary on the early church was that the Sabbath was a strong tie which united them with the life of the whole people, and in keeping the Sabbath holy, they followed not only the example, but also the command of Jesus. So it's interesting here how we see the recognition here of following the command of Christ. Now, guys, the interesting part is how the early church communicated the truth of the gospel to the world. Clement spoke about Paul after preaching both in the East and the West. He gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith of having taught righteousness to the whole world and come to the extreme limit of the West and suffering martyrdom under the prefects. Now, I've included this Latin work here, and folks, the reason why is because for me, I like to go and trace the original language and Latin documents to kind of see where these documents have spoken about this topic back during the time of the Reformation and earlier. So it allows the audience to say, you can go punch in these words on Google Books and go see, how this has been a topic of debate and discussion for many years. So it makes it easier to just find that quote really, really quick on Google Books. But, Romans 15, Paul talked about going and visiting Spain. And I'll tell you why that's interesting to me. If we go to our map here of Western Europe, you can see how Paul, if he's in Rome and he goes ultimately to Spain, there's a little city there near Barcelona where the city's called Sabadell. And it is thought to have been named after the Dell of the Sabbath keepers. Now, if you look at where he might have traveled up through the Alps, maybe places like Genoa or maybe places like certain aspects of the Swiss Alps, and he's teaching the gospel of Christ to these people here. You can see how the Sabbath might have been communicated to them, and I think this is where we see the Sabbath reflected in documents and in individuals and people groups in those areas, churches that arose up and carried the torch in the wilderness for many, many years up to the time of the Reformation. But it paints a picture of how that might have been communicated.
So are you saying the name of that place came after Paul's pilgrimage?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or Paul's journey?
Yeah. There's another aspect of Scripture, though, that I want to cover here, and that would be the day of the Lord, or the Lord's Day. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you guys are probably familiar with 2 Peter 3:10. What is the context of 2 Peter 3:10? What are we talking about here?
Second coming.
Yeah, exactly. So what's going to happen at the second coming?
It'll be sudden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very.
Visible, audible,
Mm-hmm.
lots of loud noises and flashes of lightning and brightness and
Can't miss it.
Fire.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I see here, though, is that the day of the Lord that's talked about here in the Greek, we have Kyrio and we have Hemera. Hemera being the word for day. And you guys can look this up on Bible Hub and double check.
Mm-hmm.
But, you'll always find that with the day of the Lord where there's Kyrio and there's Hemera if you go back to the Greek manuscripts. So here's a close-up of this. You guys can take a look for yourselves. Kyrio, Hemera. And you can see the same thing in 1 Thessalonians 5:2. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord shall come as a thief by night, right? So once again, Kyrio, Hemera. Hemera being the Greek word for day. Now it gets a little bit complicated because in Revelation 1:10, we have another word very similar, Kyriake Hemera, or Kyriake Hemera. Once again, the Lord's Day. And do you guys know what was the context of John's vision in Revelation 1:10? Do you remember that?
Well, it says, he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day.
Mm-hmm.
He's about to receive a vision. He's on Patmos. He's isolated. And God is about to reveal this entire vision from the book of Revelation to him.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, people have taken this to more or less assume that it meant that it's talking about Sunday. without developing a context here, John doesn't say what day it is. Like specifically, he doesn't say it was Saturday or it was Sunday. He just says on the Lord's Day. And when you put that together with a lot of other evidences, there's a couple of ideas that rise to the top. One is he's talking about the great and terrible day of the Lord, like we have in 2 Peter. So it's a reference to that. Another one is that it's talking about the Sabbath, because we don't have any evidence that suggests that John stopped keeping the Sabbath. So the Lord's Day to him would be the Sabbath, just like you have Jesus saying, and the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two ideas that arise in biblical scholarship.
Yeah, and even verse 7, he hears trumpets behind him. And you think about the trump of God, waking the dead. Like there's evidence here that this is talking once again in the same context as the previous apostles about the day of the Lord. But the problem is that this verse is sometimes used to support Sunday,
right,
when the context doesn't support that. However, once again, there is that word Hemera. Now, one of the earliest works that is referenced to talk about the change from Saturday to Sunday is the Didache. And you can read Lightfoot, who was an English theologian and preacher at St. Paul's Cathedral, Bishop of Durham, who translated this, "But every Lord's Day gather yourselves together and break bread." Now, this is plate 9, folio 80A of the Codex H, which is the earliest version of the Didache that we know of. And the problem is Hemera in this particular section right here doesn't exist. And so there have been a lot of scholars that have said, wait a second, hold on. You're translating that, but every Lord's Day gather yourselves together, and the text doesn't support that. Without the word day for Hemera, you could just as easily translate it according to the Lord's Didache, or doctrine. Okay? According to the Lord's doctrine, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanksgiving. So this work does not actually support Sunday, what people think. However, there are works like the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, "Except ye make the Sabbath a real Sabbath, ye shall not see the Father." These were sayings that supposedly Jesus said that these people in Egypt had recorded, and you can see how there's evidence there that maybe they did recognize and keep the Sabbath.
Can we back up here?
Yeah.
The slide previous. So the person who was doing this translation, that's what's in our text today.
Yeah, you will read, "But every Lord's Day gather yourselves together and break bread." But the problem is that the day that they put in there, the word Hemera, there is no Hemera.
Right. So that's pretty significant. So what do we do with that? Was that a malicious thing, or was he translating the text based off of his own bias? He truly thought that was the case.
The problem is that the word Kyriake has been so long associated with Sunday by tradition that the meaning of the word has been changed, and so they believe it means Sunday, when if you go back to Scripture and the way that the Greek is actually used, it's always been linked with Hemera.
You have it gets to be a really kind of a complicated problem, because you have multiple documents that have been left behind for translation, multiple texts, right? Then scholars will also look at not just those, but they will look at the writings of people of the day, and particularly like people who are church fathers or elders or bishops or whatever, and they'll look and see how it's used in their documents as well, to see like, the ones that we have, or does this all fit together? Does it all, support what it is? So yeah, like he's saying, people also, we're human beings. We do have biases.
Yeah.
And so you can have people that are like, well, I'm reading this and I'm translating this, and I believe this is what they meant.
But where's the place for the Holy Spirit there? Because that's very impactful for that kind of translation. I mean, doctrines are built off of it.
He's got a really good point, though, because as far back as, Council of Nicaea and all these other things, you do have the traditions of the forefathers and what they said being used as validation and justification for setting aside the Lord's Day as Sunday as far back as we can remember. So it's so hard.
But the problem is that they only quote their side of the church
I
fathers.
know, exactly. That's the thing.
Yes.
But again, they look at proof way back when to see that they are translating it, I guess, in the right way. Make sure that they have that right slant.
Okay, so for the readers today, is it for us to do our due diligence and actually look at those original texts? I mean, how deep does this go in terms of other scripture
Well,
verses?
yeah, let's take a look at some of those texts here. So Philo of Alexandria from about 20 BC to 50 A said that the seventh day is the completion of creation, for it is the festival not of a single city or country, but of the universe. I mean, that's not just Jews, that's everybody. And one of the earliest individuals in history, Polycarp. Do you guys remember who his teacher was?
No.
I thought it was John.
Exactly, the same one who wrote Revelation 1:10.
Oh.
On the preparation at the hour of dinner, there came out pursuers and horsemen, and Polycarp was killed on the day of the great Sabbath at the 8th hour. Now, the preparation would have been Friday, and on the Sabbath, he would have been killed at the 8th hour. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is here we have Christ, as his custom was. He goes in the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Paul, as his custom was, 3 Sabbaths, reasoned them from the scriptures, and then Vita Polycarpi. On the following Sabbath, he said, "Hear my exhortation, beloved children of God." There's a consistent custom there of following the apostles before him.
Yeah,
Yes.
which is one of the evidences why we can point to Revelation and say, John probably wasn't talking about Sunday if those who studied directly under him are also teaching and preaching and pointing to the Sabbath.
Yes.
What do we read in Mark 2:27 to 28? Jesus Christ is Lord of the Sabbath day. Yeah.
They also martyred pretty much everyone who stood for this. Why would it be such a threat to them? In the forefathers' thoughts.
There's this is kind of a big topic, but when you look at like why did these changes happen, he kind of alluded to like not all the churches are on the same page. You have Alexandria is very different than what's the other one? Antioch.
Yeah.
And the Romans, contrary to what people probably believe, the Romans were actually pretty religiously tolerant. They didn't have a lot of beef with people of other religions. What they had a problem with was insurrection. They wanted to be the only political power on the block. So if you were like rising up in arms against them, then they got a problem with you. So the early Christians, what they started to run into was the Jews were very much insurrectionists. They hated Rome, didn't want anything to do with Rome, wanted Rome out, and they would rise up in arms of resistance to them. So when Christians start and they keep the Sabbath and they eat a certain way and they worship a certain way and they have all these similarities with with Jews, the Romans are looking at them going, "Are you Jews?" And they get real suspicious of them. And so what that does is it puts pressure on the Christians over time to distance themselves from Jews. And there were a couple of different ways that they did that.
Yeah.
Some of the churches started worshiping on Sunday to say, no, we're not Jews. We keep this. Okay, well, we'll worship on Sunday so that you know that we're different. Yeah. Or we'll start eating unclean meats so that you know that we're different. Yeah. All kinds of different things. Not all of them did that, but some of them did to draw that distinction.
Yeah, and this is one of the earliest examples we have of some of the reasons why the change occurred. So the Epistle of Barnabas said that we keep the 8th day Sunday with joyfulness, the day also in which Jesus rose again from the dead. Now, Eusebius of Caesarea recognized that this was a spurious, fictitious book. It was influenced in such a way that wasn't an accurate work. But one of the origins for that 8th day idea was from Gnosticism. Irenaeus of Lyon, and guys, you got to remember, where is Lyon again?
France.
Yeah, exactly. It's France, or kind of around that area that Paul would have walked through on his way to Spain. We see where the Gnostics affirmed that man was formed on the 8th day, but sometimes they will have him to have been on the 6th day and sometimes on the 8th. It was a means of separating the flesh and from, because they believed that the flesh was evil and the spirit, was good. So you had the fleshly part on the 8th and his earthly part was formed on the 6th day and his fleshly part on the 8th. So these two things were distinguished by them.
Which, just real quick, sounds a little bit more like you're saying, Gnosticism,
Mhm.
or even metaphysics in the occult world, because they're always trying to separate the physical from the spiritual
Mhm.
and somehow keep them very separate. And
Mhm.
Yeah. And,
weird.
Victorinus of Petau in the 3rd century talked about the Nicolaitans, who believed that they would receive peace on the 8th day. So whoever should have committed fornication might receive peace on the 8th day. And so it just shows how, the Nicolaitans were condemned by John, right?
Mhm.
That was one of the things that God had a problem with in the 7
Mhm.
churches. They were the ones who did this peace on the 8th day business of Sunday.
And they also, I believe in the Bible, there's a verse about the Nicolaitans specifically being
Mhm.
called out by Jesus, or God has
Yeah.
his thoughts on them and how he despises them.
Exactly.
It's questioned on whether or not he was actually one of the original 7 deacons and went astray.
Oh,
And because I think Nicholas was one of the 7 deacons. And so this, would have made him a very prominent figure. So the fact that he, took a left turn in history and was able to lead people away, it would make sense,
Mhm.
from some perspective. But yeah, he was.
Now, briefly, who are the 7 deacons, or where does that come
Well,
in?
you're talking about after the early Christians, the leaders were like, we can't handle all this stuff. We can't be waiting on tables and this kind of
Uh-huh.
thing in the early church. So they're like, okay, we need to appoint 7 deacons, the early apostles.
Mhm.
And so people like Stephen,
Ah,
he was one of the 7 deacons, the
Okay.
first Christian martyr. So
okay.
I don't have them all memorized off the top of my head, but
Mm.
Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, said on the 6th day God finished his works which he'd made and rested on the 7th day. And he recognized that this word Sabbath is translated into Greek the 7th, a name that is adopted by every nation, although they know not the reason of this appellation. And you
Oh,
can think about
wow.
this today in the languages like Sabado, or Sabato or Saboda, or all the different languages that you can think of, that the Sabbath is
Mhm.
on the 7th day. Pseudo-Athanasius, there's been some discussion about whether or not this was Athanasius or Archelaus or somebody else, but he said that we assemble on Saturday, not that we are infected with Judaism, but only to worship Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath.
Amen.
And, this was recognized later on in like the time of the Reformation with, primitive Christianity, where they assembled on Saturdays, not that they were infected with Judaism, but just to worship Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, a lot of people will interpret Hebrews 4:9 to say, well, okay, Jesus is my Sabbath. And what they're conflating is the person with the time,
Mhm.
And so Origen answers that question, where on Hebrews 4:9, he says, there remaineth therefore a Sabbatismos, that word you mentioned
Mhm.
earlier.
Mhm.
That is a keeping of the Sabbath to the people of God. So there's no question. They didn't misinterpret this to say, oh, well, Jesus is my Sabbath, so therefore I don't have to keep a day at all anymore, which is kind of ludicrous if you think about it, because they're busy keeping Sunday. So why would you keep any day then?
yeah, it doesn't
Mhm.
make sense.
Yeah. Now, Tertullian initially scorned the seventh-day Sabbath, but after becoming more acquainted with the more conservative Christian groups from Asia Minor, you think about the East, they kept it way farther than the West. And he said later on in his works, thus Christ did not at all rescind the Sabbath, he kept the law thereof. But more so, he consecrated it an additional sanctity by his own beneficent action, for he gave this day divine safeguards, a course which his adversary would have pursued for some other days. Well, doesn't that sound familiar? That sounds like Sunday, right?
Mhm.
Mm.
To avoid honoring the Creator's Sabbath. So there you have it, folks. There is a recognition that there was some recognition of the Sabbath there in the early church. And Socrates Scholasticus said almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries of the Sabbath of every week, yet the Christians of Alexandria and at Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this. Now, what
Mhm.
was Alexandria infected with?
The occult.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was the seat of Satan for a long time.
Yeah.
exactly.
Antioch is the place where they were first called Christians, according to the book of Acts. So it was a stronghold of Christianity.
Mhm.
Yeah, Aphrahat, a Syrian, said that, let us observe the Sabbath of God in a manner which pleases his will. Let us enter into the Sabbath of rest, in which the heaven and earth take Sabbath rest. All creatures will dwell in peace and take rest. So, he knew that the Sabbath remained. And Archelaus if you guys remember, I don't know if you remember who Archelaus debated against, but he debated Manny. Manny was a Gnostic who ultimately formed the Manichaeans.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the Manichaeans ultimately influenced people like Augustine, right?
Oh,
So
which is a church father of the
Exactly.
Catholic
Yeah,
Church. Okay.
exactly. But he came from Manichaeanism, from Manny,
Mm-hmm.
and this is kind of the other side of the table with Archelaus. As the assertion that the Sabbath has been abolished, we deny that he has abolished it plainly, for he was himself also Lord of the Sabbath. And there you can see where he denied the destruction of the Sabbath. Now, Jeremy Taylor in the 17th century recognized that the keeping of the Sabbath on the seventh day continued until the time of the Laodicean Council. Now, at least perhaps in the majority, there were still those who kept it, as we'll see. But at the time of the Laodicean Council, there was this canon number 29, where Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day. So it wasn't a case of just, you can't rest on it anymore. No, you have to actually profane it.
Don't you love this, though? If I look at this, they're actually making a distinction even within this quote of the Sabbath versus the Lord's Day.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's not one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, in the East, there was a little bit of pushback on this. So Gregory of Nyssa said, how can you look upon the Lord's Day if you neglect the Sabbath? So they gradually kind of had this day creep in, but they knew that they were not supposed to neglect the Sabbath day. Gregory of Nyssa knew that. But even the East kind of gradually fell away over time. And John of Chrysostom, though, indicated that there were many among who fast on the same day as the Jews and keep the Sabbath in the same manner. So there was many people who kept it still.
One of the things that was also transpired to create that distinction between Sabbath and Sunday is it came to the point where when Sunday was going to be emphasized, fasting on Sabbath would be emphasized, on Saturday would be emphasized. And that wasn't typical in the Jewish culture. It was a day of feasting, whereas you might eat 2 meals a day, most of the week. On Sabbath, you'd be eating 3. Or, it was a day of family and fellowship and joy and all this. But, if you want to make something real downer, make it so that people aren't eating on that day. They're not going to look forward to it like, oh boy, I'm really excited about this day. I'm fasting. They get hangry.
Well, the interesting thing is that even though Sunday began to creep in, they didn't actually rest on the day. So St. Jerome, and I say some did not rest on the day, some did. But we see Lady Paula, who, if you know, was kind of St. Jerome's, student, if you will, or some suggested later on maybe his girlfriend, but Lady Paula, who lived at Bethlehem, after service was over on Sunday, would go with her fellow female friends and would go doing their tasks of making clothes and garments. So they did work on the Lord's Day, and this was attested to by Bishop Francis White in 1635, but you can go back and read it in Jerome's works as well. So they didn't rest on Sunday. That's kind of a newer institution since Laodicea and, of course, later on as well. But, St. Ambrose, you guys have probably heard of the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a lot of people don't know that that's actually directly connected back to that institution of fasting on God's Sabbath as a means of degrading it and elevating the institution of man of Sunday. Now, Asterius of Emesa, again, you can see this in the East where they continued to keep holy the Sabbath. He said that joining together in concourse of these 2 days is excellent among Christians of the Sabbath, and the Lord's Day, which in a circle returning time brings about every week. For as mothers and nurses of the church, they both assemble the people and cause the priests to sit down together and to teach them. So both lead and impel as well the disciples as their teachers, so then care of souls. Now, there's obviously a change that occurred there. Can you guys think of a text in the Old Testament that talked about somebody who would change divine law?
In Daniel 7.
Yep, Daniel 7:25. There was also a warning in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 about a power that would exalt itself above everything that is called God. And in the Latin Vulgate, it's actually et extolitor supra omni. And here we have the Pope in the Decretals of Gregory IX talking about his power to dispense above the law. Okay, supra. It's the same thing in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 about the man of sin or Antichrist. The church began to think that it had power to change legally Saturday to Sunday. And Rabanus Maurus, an abbot of Fulda in Mainz, Germany, said that Pope Sylvester was the one that decreed the rest from Sabbath should be transferred to the Lord's Day. So we can see, now I find that interesting about Sylvester, because Sylvester was the same pope that some of the inquisitors later referenced about the origins of the Vaudois or the Waldenses. And so to me, it's interesting that there's a possible connection there. But in the 4th century apostolic constitutions, once again, there were still some groups that kept the Sabbath day and the Lord's Day. So they had leisure to go to church for instruction in piety. The slaves worked 5 days, but on the Sabbath day they had rest. Now, Sozomen in the 5th century said that the people of Constantinople and several other cities assembled together on the Sabbath as well as on the next day, which custom is never observed at Rome or at Alexandria. Another witness besides Socrates of Scholasticus that Rome and Alexandria were the ones to... Have you guys ever heard the accusation, well, you just went off and started your own church? Well, who really went off and started their own church here, right?
Yeah.
Here we got the whole rest of the world doing something different, and the Bishop of Rome is going off and starting his own church, you know? So Sidonius said that it is a fact that it was formerly the custom of the East to keep the Sabbath in the same manner as the Lord's Day and to hold sacred assemblies. And he, of course, he lists all those people, Asterius and Gregory of Nyssa and all these people. So we're not the only ones that allude to those early church fathers. Sidonius did so all the way back in the 5th century.
And it actually still happens today in many churches, whether they're Orthodox or Catholic, they will have a Sabbath service. I know I was kind of surprised about that. I went to England many years back, and we were there in London at Westminster Abbey, and happened to arrive on a Saturday, and they were having services, and I was like, oh, I didn't know you did that.
Yeah. It spread all over. It spread up to Scotland and Ireland, and, St. Patrick in the Book of Armagh. You can access this online. I actually went through it and found in the original language there where there's this angel, Victoricus, who was wont to come to him on every 7th day of the week. And as one man talks with another, so Patrick enjoyed the angel's conversation. And that wasn't alone to him. There were many people throughout history who had angels who came and talked to them on the Sabbath day and spent time with them. We've got a lot more examples of that. So Columba himself said that, of course, when he came to die on the Saturday, the 9th of June, he said, this day is called the Sabbath. That is the day of rest. So he knew which day was the day of rest. And such it will truly be to me, because obviously, he died on that day. But, even our opponents, like the Catholics, recognize that Alphonse, like Bellersheim, for example, said that the Scots in this matter had no doubt kept up the traditional practice of the ancient monastic Church of Ireland, which observes Saturday rather than Sunday as the day of rest. And Moffat, another scholar back in 1883, said that it seems to have been customary in the Celtic churches of early times in Ireland as well as Scotland to keep Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, as a day of rest from labor. Now, they faced some pushback later on, of course, in the 11th century. The Queen Margaret, her biographer Turgot, tells how there were several reforms she tried to institute for these early Scots. And one of the things that she comments about them is that they neglected the reverence of the Lord's Day as in other days, so he too has to insist on laboring that he is not at all allowed. They worked on Sundays. She didn't like that. Yeah. Now, there was a lot of persecution that these early people faced. In the church councils, one of the punishments was that the slave shall receive 100 stripes. If you worked on Sunday, you had to get beaten. Is that principle of coercion, is that something that's consistent?
It's not exactly religious tolerance.
Yeah,
Mm-mm.
exactly. Justinian I, back in his novella 144, you got to remember that Justinian was one of the individuals who his codex established civil power for the Roman pontiff back in 538. And one of the first things that happened was that there was punishments instituted for any Samaritans that would return to their former error and be detected in observing the Sabbath. So here we have a kind of bookend for papal power in 538, all the way down to, Justinian's law, not Justinian, but Napoleon's codex, all the way down in the 1798, where there's this attack on those who kept the Sabbath. And one of the first ones to do that was Pope Gregory the First, who called individuals who preached about the Sabbath Antichrist.
Oh, wow.
Now, they're literally trying to follow the example of Christ, and he's calling them Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, isn't to me, that sounds like Gnosticism, where you just flip the truth
Yeah.
directly on its head. And, some of the attempts that they went through to try and influence, of course, later on in like the 8th century, you see where Rome tried to literally forge documents like the King Dominic right here, where they would threaten that if you don't keep Sunday, that there was going to be heavy, stony hailstorms, flying serpents, and heathens shall come to you from me, a race of pagans who will carry you into bondage. Now, I got to put my modern cap here on a moment. Does this sound at all like climate change?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you have somebody at the end of time who tries to pull the same thing and say, well, we're going to get sulfurous fire and thunder and lightning if we don't rest on this day, to me, it's something they've tried for 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like Sodom and Gomorrah, as though they're justifying sulfurous fire upon you for not doing it.
Yeah. Even in the language of like the East, you can see how the Sabbath is integrated into their words, like godly.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can see how it's built up of like the number 7 and tent and worshiping for humble, and godliness is like tent, 7th day, and clean clothes. And, in Exodus 16, verse 29, the Lord has given you the 7th day to stay in your tents and don't go out and pick up food from the ground that day. This was obviously before Mount Sinai when the law was given. So obviously the Sabbath existed before Mount Sinai. And, I think about too how the apostles taught where the oracles of God were given unto us. Mm-hmm. So this wasn't something that was exclusive to the Jews, and it was reflected even in the language in the East.
My favorite one, or one of my favorite ones, is the one for boat, where it's like 8 people. And I'm like, where would you get that? Like, there's no other story.
Right.
We actually have a show that we filmed a couple of years ago of a
did.
Chinese pastor. We'll put a link in the
Very
description
fascinating.
if you want a deeper study in this. But you can tell the spirit that's behind this based off of the progression of how it's getting more and more intolerant, force, coercion, and now even threats, making threats from, as they're trying to say, from God. That if you don't follow this, this is your doom, your destruction.
Yeah. In China, this was even etched into their stills. This was an 8th century one where the 7th day we offer sacrifices after having purified our hearts and received absolution for our sins. This religion so perfect and so excellent is difficult to name, but it enlightens darkness by its brilliant precepts. And it was in the same century that over in, once again, France and northern Italy, where, you have the Council of Friuli, where we command all Christians to observe the Lord's Day to be held. When speaking of that Sabbath, what the Jews observe the last day of the week, and which also our peasants observe. Now, hold up, folks. We got peasants keeping this in addition to Jews. It sounds to me like maybe they weren't Jews, but they kept the Sabbath. Oh, Christians keeping the 7th day Sabbath in the 8th century. Later on, of course. Yeah.
Insinuation is no educated person with it. This is just peasants doing this.
Right.
Like they're just dumb, uneducated masses.
Never mind the fact that, of course, later on when Reinerius Sacco, the 12th century inquisitor, goes and interviews these peasants, he can find that they can repeat the entire New Testament word for word, and even the book of Job on top of that. I mean, they were very, very
That's
well
incredible.
educated. They knew their Bible backwards and forwards.
Wow.
And, we can see, of course, how Thomas had some influence on the Christians in India later on, the witness of Charles Dellin in 1687. But you can see how when the period of the auto de fe approaches, the individuals were charged of having Judaized by attending the solemnization of the Sabbath. And he witnessed that. And over in Ethiopia, of course, there was a lot of witnesses as well to the Ethiopians continuing to keep the Sabbath day. And this was testified not only by the church history of Ethiopia, but you can also see even the Cardinal Bellarmine, the Jesuit cardinal, said that the Ethiopians used these constitutions, those apostolic constitutions, as truly apostolic for the reason of being more mistaken about the worship of the Sabbath and Sunday. They command to observe the Sabbath. Ethiopian church, there's some that over there that still keep the Sabbath to this day.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was something that obviously it was continuing to be kept.
It's almost like they had this, anti-Semitic undertone to accomplish all of this.
Well, and you can see where the idea of you being a Jew was used as a theological slur for any Christian who legitimately obeyed the law of God. It was all it was a theological slur.
Mhm.
And in the 9th
Yeah.
century, Photius accused, once again, witnesses of these Sabbath keepers, because you observe the Sabbath with the Jews and the Lord's Day with us, you seem to imitate with such observance the sect of Nazarenes.
I guess it shouldn't be surprising that, by the time you get to Martin Luther, it doesn't really have this real favorable position or disposition toward the Jews. I mean, if you have centuries of, well, it's those Jews that did this, then kind of wind up that way.
Now, you guys are probably aware that there occurred in the 11th century a split between the East and the West.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, when the Bishop of Rome wrote to the Eastern bishop, the Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople, you can see where when Michael of Cerularius wrote an open letter back to the Bishop of John, he said, "For we are commanded also to honor the Sabbath equally with the Lord's Day and to keep it and not to work on it." Now, he admitted that they had ceased to do that practice, at least in some sections of the East. But he knew that they were supposed to keep it and not to work on it. But the problem was Rome wanted everybody to fast on it. And so ultimately the bishops came and denounced the East bitterly, placed their writ of excommunication or separation right there on the altar and left. And so there was a contention over taking it not just where we don't rest on it anymore, but no, you've got to actually fast on the day and profane it. And that's where the East said, no, we've had enough.
Mm-hmm.
And they walked away. But there were those who continued to keep it, and we can see them hiding up in the Alps and keeping it, of course, up in with the Vaudois or the Waldenses. One of the individuals that wrote against them was Monetta of Cremona, and he accused them of, in trying to argue against them using Galatians 4:10 and Colossians 2:16, which we already talked about, Colossians 2:16, and he accuses them of being like the Galatians in chapter 4:16. Now, what do you guys know about the Galatians in chapter 4:16? Who were the Galatians, first off?
I'm not completely sure.
You mean like what part of the world are they from?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we know that
They're from like Spain.
Yeah,
Gaul.
yeah, exactly, Gaul, and they weren't Jews originally, right?
No.
So if they were returning back, if they were apostatizing, when Paul writes his letter to the Galatians, he observed days, months, and times. If they were apostatizing and going back to paganism, would they have been going back to the seventh-day Sabbath? They never kept it to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they were apostatizing and going back in error, first off, it wouldn't be of keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. So that, first off, is not a fair charge by this inquisitor. But also we can see in Deuteronomy 18:10 and Isaiah 47:13 examples of observers of times or monthly prognosticators or pagan days that were kept even back in ancient Israel's day. And so they would have been apostatizing back to that ancient Babylonian practice, which might have actually included Sunday rest. But, nevertheless, it wasn't going back to Seventh-day Sabbath keeping.
You find the same thing when he's writing to the Ephesian church. He tells them in Ephesians, you were once in darkness, but now you're children of the light, walk as children of the light.
Yeah.
And you look at the history of the Ephesian church, and they were entrenched in paganism and witchcraft and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And, once again, here's another shot of that text right there. But he wasn't the only one to accuse them of keeping the Seventh-day Sabbath. The Jesuit Inquisitor Francis Pegny said, regarding the word in sabbatati, many used to think it came from Sabbath, that they observed the Sabbath according to the custom of the Jews. Now, a lot of people today have doubted whether or not the Waldenses kept the Seventh-day Sabbath, citing either 20th century sources, the Jesuit Jacob Gretzer, who interpreted in sabbatati to reference shoes, or have said, well, Waldenses today don't keep the Sabbath, which is true, they don't, but the ancient ones, the evidence suggests that they did. In fact, even the Catholic historian Ignaz von Dollinger said that not a few celebrate the Sabbath with the Jews, non nulli verocum Judaeus sabbatum celebrant. And there's a third inquisitor, the Bonacursus, who said not a few, but many know the errors of those who are called Pasagani. First, they teach that we should obey the Sabbath. Furthermore, so increase their error and condemn and reject all the church fathers and the whole Roman church.
There you go, though. That's the whole thing, is rejecting the church fathers or tradition and the whole Roman church teaching.
Exactly. It's a question of authority.
Right.
Whose seal are you carrying? Have you guys ever noticed, like, Sabaoth, the word for Sabaoth actually has oth in it, right? At the very end? Well, oth is a Hebrew word. If you go back to, for example, Exodus 31:17, where there's this seal that God wants to put, or Ezekiel 20 verse 12 or 20 verse 20, that seal, that mark of authority is directly connected to even the word Sabbath itself. Now, Melchior Goldast also said about the Waldenses, not because they were circumcised, but because they kept the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath, were the Waldenses called in sabbatati. Doesn't say, it's not a reference to Sunday Sabbath there, but the Jewish Sabbath. Now, they didn't, they were a very humble people. They didn't seek to cause offense to others. And so it was interesting how some of the inquisitors referenced them working on holidays secretly. So days that Rome would consider like holy days, these people were secretly working. And they did so as a means of not causing offense, not giving unnecessary offense to others who believed that, but they didn't think it was a sin to work on that day. We saw that back with Lady Paula back in the early church, how she had no problem going back and working on the day.
Right.
Now the Tulorpans, these were some 15th century Picardy Waldense Sabbatarians, said that, they upheld the Saturday as to be celebrated instead of Sunday. Samedi and le dimanche. But Paul Bouzart also recognized that they celebrated the Sabbath instead of Sunday. And in fact, we have a couple of names here, Gulibert Tullin and Simon Beckwith, a couple of individuals who were arrested by the Inquisition later on. And there were 6 weeks later, before a crowd of 10 to 12,000 people, there were several of them who were burned at the stake. And so that's, I think, one reason why a lot of people don't see this history anymore is because there's been entire books that have been burned. There have been people that have been burned. The witnesses and the evidence has been tried to been wiped out of the pages of history. And so instead of trusting their Bible, they go read the history that's been fed to them and miss that there's a whole other side of the story that hasn't been told.
Now, this history that you're bringing up, and especially this particular evidence, is it from, like, where's it from, I guess?
Yeah, so this right here is Paul Bouzart, and it's actually, I got this one from, I believe it was either archive.org or the French National Library. I don't know, one of them I did get from the French National Library, but this particular work was written in 1912, although we do find some of the evidence going back earlier. And for example, this one right here, where this was a work by the Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, and he wrote against the Waldensium seu Picardorum heresim. So that's the Waldenses or the Picardorium, the Picardy heresies. We just saw a reference to Picardy just a moment ago. And he said, it is a matter of their blindness over the change of the Sabbath, the mutationem sabbati. With that, they do not recognize the authority of the Roman and Apostolic Church. Now, one of the things I find is that interesting about that word mutationem. Mutationem is a Latin word to change. And if you go open your Latin Vulgate and you turn to Daniel 7, verse 25, the little horn that changes times and laws, it's the same word.
Like
It's the same
mutation or
word.
something.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
they're just not recognizing the little horn of Daniel 7:25, and that little horn that drank the blood of the saints did exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
And we can find evidence of that in September 14th, 1492, where there were hundreds arrested. And this exchange right here is so interesting, how the Inquisitor Gregory comes after Anthony Farrar, and he says, he says, you must be Jews since you say that the law of Moses is still binding. And the answer was, well, we say that the 10 Commandments are still binding. And he says, yes, instead of observing the festivals of the Holy Church and honoring the holy day of the Lord on which he rose from the dead, you are accustomed to meet for worship on the old Sabbath or Saturday. And they said, we did indeed rest and attend to divine worship upon the seventh day, even as God commanded.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a
So
continuous
it's
redirection. Like, no, it's not about custom or Jewish custom. It's what the Lord commanded us to do.
Exactly.
Well, guys, before we close out here for the time period up to the Reformation, we got to take a look here at some of the ways which people were manipulated to keep Sunday. And this is an example of the Annals of Roger de Hoveden in 1201, where those who came up to the Lord's Day, they could neither buy nor sell anything. So there was a prohibition on commerce on the Lord's Day, where you couldn't buy or sell anything. But more so, you can see this reflected in Pope Alexander III, Synod of Tours, the Third Lateran Council, multiple instructions against these Waldenses, where if you were not obedient to the Apostolic See, you couldn't sell or buy.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound familiar at all?
Sounds very familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly almost like a reflection of what you're going to see at the end of time, where you can't buy or sell.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an argument over authority. In fact, William the Conqueror, in his time period, in 1084, you can see Bernald of Constantiensis, where he speaks about William the Conqueror. He made all the land of English tributary to the Roman pontiff and did not allow anyone in his power to buy or sell anything who was found disobedient to the Apostolic See.
Mm-hmm.
There you have it. No buy, no sell.
Mhm.
That happened during Rome's history. They're the ones that came along and said, no, you can't buy or sell if you don't obey our laws. What an interesting parallel to the end of time. Now, those who refuse to learn from the mistakes of history are due to repeat them,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So doesn't Revelation talk about a beast that was, is not, and yet is?
Mm-hmm.
This is going to happen at the end of time.
Yes. It's fascinating because you look at the way God does things and you look at the way Satan does things, and here his way is force all the way. Force, force, force. On the Sabbath, God also asks us not to buy and sell.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't say, well, if you don't, I'm going to force you. He just says, no, you know what? If you won't, I want your full attention. And to get your full attention, I want to make sure you're not involved in all these other enterprises. I don't want to be competing for our relational dynamic. So I'm asking that of you. Would you please not do those things so that we can commune together?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying you will, it's will you.
Mm-hmm.
But he asks that for us. He doesn't do that without providing. Because when you think
No, he
about
doesn't.
it, the Sabbath is a privilege, so to speak.
Mhm.
Not working, not buying or selling. That means you've been provided for to be able to enjoy such a thing. And that is the two things that go together when it comes to following God's way.
Yeah. I was just listening in Leviticus this morning, and he was talking about, when you come into a land, make sure that you don't harvest during this time. And God's like reasoning with him. He's like, I know that's going to be hard on you, but when you do that, the next time you plant, you're going to harvest like 3 times as much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to provide for you till like the 9th year. So don't worry about the 7th year when you're not sowing in the land. It's, it'll do its own thing, but you'll have enough.
Mm-hmm.
I will make sure you have enough.
But that's why
So-
these kinds of conversations I believe are more important, or should be the preliminary before we start talking about doctrines or telling people you should just keep Sabbath. It's because, well, how can you ask me to do that when there's so many things to get done, during that time period? So focusing on what God provides and his blessings, and not just that, but also being part of the solution, helping people in their distress. And I mean, practical religion, as James talks about, helping the widows and the orphans and all that, so that they can be relieved of their burden. As the commandment is written in Exodus and Deuteronomy, God says, because I have taken this bondage away from you, therefore go ahead and enjoy the Sabbath. And we need to be part of helping people understand that.
Yeah.
The Sabbath is really, it's not about, us trying to look at this and try to prove people that we're right.
Right.
It's an invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even our invitation. It's God's invitation.
Right.
God is saying, you know what? I love you. I want to spend time with you. This is the time that I've set aside. And it doesn't mean you can't spend time with God every day, but it's the only day that God said, this is the one I blessed. This is the one I sanctified. This is the day that I inhabit to be with my people. So come and join me. And when we do that, we experience that bountiful blessing that you're talking about. And God does provide for us. You can look at the scriptures in the New Testament, which is really the point of contention in Christianity. And you'll find there's only nine verses that have anything to do with the first day of the week. That's it. And that may be even including the one in Revelation that people, but that's the sum total of texts. 5 of those texts are the same event.
Yeah.
They're just repeated in the Gospels. So really you're talking about there's 4 scriptures, 4 events that we're building an entire foundation on throughout history. 4.
Right.
I mean, go look it up for yourself. Anybody can go. The Bible's public domain. You can look it up and there's dozens and dozens of versions. You can check that out. But 4. Do you know there are 9 references? No. I might have gotten that backwards. I think there's 8 texts that talk about the first day of the week. I think it's 8. 5 of them in the same event. So you have 4 texts. There are 9 references to the Sabbath in the book of Acts alone. 9.
In Acts alone. Okay.
Just in Acts. That's pretty astounding to me when you look at, the weight of evidence. Like, what are we talking about? And we have no specific direction or command where Jesus or the apostles say to do otherwise, which it seems pretty clear. You have some derivations like we talked about, like Jesus could be talking about, hey, Jerusalem was about to be destroyed. Make sure that on Sunday, but he doesn't say that. Doesn't say that. And so all these things speak a volume of evidence. And so we want to invite you all to experience that blessing. And if you haven't ever before, you don't know what to do, you're unsure, you got questions, reach out to us. We're here to answer your questions as best as we know how, and so that you can share in the same blessing. So I want to thank you, James, for coming. I know at the beginning of the show, we asked about you had a YouTube channel where you talk about this and many other topics, and it's called Biblical Hope, right? So check out Biblical Hope, James's YouTube channel. We'll have a link in the description below, so you can check out and see what other things he's talking about. I love history. I like talking about history, so I find these things very fascinating. I know Aubrey likes history too. I think Kendi does.
Yeah.
She may not voice it as much as the rest of us, but she likes it. We like history. We like, what it teaches us, because we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past.
We want to know the truth.
We want to know the truth. So I invite you guys to check that out. This has been another episode of LED Live. Thank you for watching. Make sure you like this episode. Subscribe. If you've never subscribed before, do that for us. It helps our numbers. And if you've never been here before, check out our other videos. We have lots of them. We have playlists to help you if you're interested in a particular topic. You can also help us out to make more of these. Go to lls.tv/give, or you can find us on Patreon. Both of those work. We actually get a better rate if you go through our website. So that's just a plug for us. Also, if you want to help us out, we make t-shirts at lightwear.shop. You can check them out, like the one I'm wearing, which is this knockoff of Reese's, and it just says redeemed. And I think that's the typical things we talk about. So yeah, I think I went through the role. Thank you guys. Hope you can join us next time. And this has been LED Live. We'll see you next time.
All right, I can do this. All right.
There are conventional ways of sharing the gospel, but some may need a different way of doing things.
Never mind.
A way that gets the message out with confidence.
Wow, cool shirt. What's it mean?
Oh, thank you. You know, we're all made with a unique fingerprint, but we're all God's artwork.
Wow, where'd you get it?
Lightwear, wear your witness.
Jacob, and he who formed you, Israel. I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God. He is strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. The Lord shall renew his strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.
Hey, subscribe to Lula Studios en español. Vas a encontrar muchos videos de Lula Studios que están traducidos en español y también contenido exclusivamente para nuestra audiencia latina. If you want to learn Spanish, a great way will be watching our videos for practice.